Motherhood is where it all begins. It is our literal origin story, and as a therapist, I knew we could do a better job supporting new moms. Come with me on this journey as we build the digital village, one family at a time. Pregnancy and infant loss is one of those sensitive subjects that you really don't want to hear about until you really do. So join me today as I talk with Meghann, who's both a therapist and a mom with personal and professional experience with this issue. I hope you find it as supportive, empathetic, and instructive as I did. Meghann, I'm so glad you're here talking about, miscarriage and loss with us, because I feel like this is one of those topics where you really don't want to hear about it. Until you really do.
Yeah.
It's like, sort of like a content warning. If people didn't see the title, we're going to talk about pregnancy, loss, miscarriage, stillbirth. We're going to talk about infant loss. And if you're happily, healthfully pregnant and not experiencing that, it's like the last thing you want to talk about. And then if you do experience it, you're like, why does nobody talk about it?
Exactly. When I went through a miscarriage and when I went through it, one of my best friends had gone through it couple months before me, and she said I'm part of a club I never wanted to be part of. And it's exactly the truth. I mean, it's like any hard thing in life, I feel like there's a club for it, and then once you're in it and you understand it, you need the information.
Yeah. And it's this balance of like, we as like working in this population, we're not trying to go around and talk about it with people who are doing good. Right. But like, you want there to be enough information out there that people feel like they know where to go when they need it. Yeah. Because the last thing you need when you're like deeply in grief is to feel isolated and feel like you're the only one.
Yeah. Yeah. And I feel like I was just gonna say, I feel like when you're in it, even when other people have gone through it, you still feel like the only one because it's happening to you right then. And even if you know other people who've gone through it, a lot of times they're farther along in the journey. And so just to have a space to go learn about it is really, I think, huge.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. My first pregnancy ended in miscarriage, and I certainly felt like, and this is like, I'm older than you. I'm older than maybe the average person listening to this. So this was literally pre-Facebook for me. So I really felt isolated because I didn't have any friends that had experienced it, I thought. And then as I was like processing my grief, people would come out and be like, oh yeah, that happened to me too. And I thought, well, I sure wish you'd been around 3 months ago. Like I could have really used that input. So this is one of those things where I'm thankful for social media, because I do feel like there's an opportunity to make connection when you want it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And to know, and that's something that we'll talk about before that we're done, like what resources are available and where we can, guide people. But I think one of the important things to start out by saying is, if you're listening to this, probably it's because you or someone you love have experienced some kind of grief or loss. Like I don't imagine that otherwise you'd be drawn to listening to what we're talking about right now. So, one of the worst things that I see for my clients and for myself is like isolation around grief. I don't feel like grief does well in isolation.
No, not at all. It just grows. I mean, grief is hard enough. And when you're sitting in it alone, it just grows, and the darkness is so it's overcoming. I mean, I think about how much support I had during my time of loss, and I'm realizing I was an exception in terms of how many people I had around me at the time that understood it, offered space for me. And honestly, I think that's a huge part of why I wanted to get into this population, was going through something like that, and then having the support that I had, seeing what it made a huge difference in my life to have the support, to have people sitting in the space with me, not trying to push me through it, not trying to get me anywhere else, just sitting in it with me.
Oh, I love that so much. I love hearing that. And that's good. That's a good question, like segue into a question I had, which is, if somebody's listening to this because somebody they love just experienced a loss and they're like not really sure how to do anything worthwhile, what did you feel like was most helpful during that time? I mean,
it's a good question, because I feel like it's really hard to hold space for someone who's actively in grief. I mean, it is, you have to sit in it with them. You have to try really hard to not offer solutions, try really hard to, even if you don't know what to say that. Say, I really don't know how to support you right now, but I'm here.
I think it's one of
Try
the most beautiful statements a human can make is like, I don't actually have the answer, but I am here.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And that we don't, when we're supporting people who are in grief and loss, we don't have to help them find meaning. They will get there in their journey whenever they're going to get there, if they get there. But we
Hmm.
as the supporters don't have to help them find that meaning. We just have to sit in it with them. I mean, I really feel like that is the most powerful thing I can offer to clients who are going through grief or loss. And it was the most powerful thing that happened for me when I was in it too.
Oh, I love what you just said, Megan. I really want to highlight it. Like, we don't have to help them find meaning. And so let me decode that because you're saying it so eloquently. I want to pause and make sure people understand what you're saying. What I'm hearing is like, we don't need to offer platitudes. We don't need to tell them everything happens for a reason. They're in a better place, any sort of, here's how I handled my loss and the meaning I got from my loss. And so this is the meaning that you should have.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you know, or even I'll say the insertion of like there is no meaning. There shouldn't
Mm-hmm.
be meaning because
Mm-hmm.
that's how I experienced my loss was there's no meaning. So there's no meaning. Like all around, one of the best things we can do if somebody we love has experienced a loss is to hold space because they are going to seek their own meaning.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. And we can trust them and we can follow their lead.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And it's not, and especially, loss in terms of this specific perinatal loss, there's such a range. There's not one size fits all in terms of how you experience the loss, when the loss was. There really isn't a one size fits all. So, like you said, don't offer platitudes, things like at least you were only 10 weeks along, things
Mm-hmm.
like that. At least you can
You can
get
have
pregnant
another
again.
one. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and they're intended to be helpful. I really believe people have good
Mm-hmm.
intentions, but they end up just hitting in the complete wrong way. The
Right.
message that I think the person who's experiencing grief gets is you shouldn't be grieving. And the
Right.
reality is
Could
it
you
is
tuck that away,
such
please?
a huge,
It's
yeah,
like they're saying, like,
yeah,
could you
tuck
please
it away
could you tuck that away? Could you like wrap it up for me, please? Is kind of,
because
and
it's
I
making
don't,
me uncomfortable.
yeah. And I don't think that here's what I'll say. When you love somebody who's grieving, the depths of darkness and pain is so painful by proxy. It's
Mm-hmm.
like you would do anything if somebody you love's in pain, you do anything to take that pain away from them.
Yeah.
It's very hard to sit by while they're in pain. And I think it was Glennon Doyle who's an author. I've heard it certainly other places, but she was maybe one of the first places I've heard it where she said like pain is sacred. And
Mm-hmm.
I think what she means is like it's uniquely yours. It's your
Mm-hmm.
own,
Yeah.
right? And when people try to take pain from us, no matter how well intentioned they are, ultimately they do us a disservice because the only way out of this is through it. And
Mm-hmm.
if people are blocking our path through it, even if it's from a good place, what it ends up doing is sort of stunting the healing process. We have to be allowed to be in truthful pain,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? And we have to allow ourselves to be in truthful pain. I think that's like another segue, which is some people who are listening to us right now, like they may already have a child or they may have people counting on them for one reason or another. And they may feel like, I can't, I don't have the space to fall apart.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not
Yeah.
going to let myself. I'm going to keep going.
Mm-hmm.
Do you
Yeah.
feel like you see that with people when you counsel them in their grief or that you experience that yourself, like that push to keep going?
Yeah, all the time. I mean, and sometimes I really try to, well, actually most times I really try to honor that with clients, especially if they're not ready to look at it or they sought out therapy, but they're not quite there yet. And I'll still sit in it with them in the little bits that they're willing to talk about. But I really try to respect that too, of just people, especially if you're having other kids and you have other things going on in life, you have to keep going sometimes. And so
Mm-hmm.
that's okay too. It really
Mm-hmm.
isn't again, it's not a one size fits all. um
Yep.
and and I do believe that grief will catch up to us even if we're not, even if we're not looking at it right now. It's there,
Yeah.
it's in our body, and it's going to catch up to us. But
Yeah.
everyone has their own process for getting there.
Yeah. Yep. I love that. It's in their body. Absolutely
Mm.
true. Yeah. I know that to be true from my own experiences of grief and from helping other people through it. It's like really physically present.
Yep. Yeah.
Yep. And you
And
can kind of be
especially,
like, not today, I'm busy, but it's still there waiting.
yep. Yep. And especially, I think it was Esther Perel that I heard say this, but that this type, especially miscarriage type of loss, is such an ambiguous type of grief. It's this,
Mm,
it's And depending on when the loss is in the pregnancy, I was 10 weeks along, and so it was one of those things that most of the world didn't know I was pregnant, and so my job at the time had no clue what I was going through. So
Mm-hmm.
it was like I had absolutely lost. I lost twins, and I lost
Mm-hmm.
two babies, and I experienced it in that way, but the
Yeah.
world didn't know.
Had
I
no
was,
idea.
yeah, so you're walking through the world with this, you're bleeding, you're going through just a really intense time, and
Mm-hmm.
the world doesn't know. And so it's this ambiguous kind of grief, and it's also this grief where you're grieving a path you never got to live. So you're grieving, your brain already imagined the due date, what you're at the
Mm-hmm.
time. I still have an older daughter, and so I was imagining their age gap and what it would be like for her to be an older sister. And so you
Mm-hmm.
have to grieve that entire path that you never got to live, and that's just such a
Yeah.
different type of grief.
Yes. Yes. It's so, highlighting like pregnancy loss carries with it such a physical process,
Mm-hmm.
right? There's the climb of like early pregnancy hormones and whatever's going with that, like nausea or pain or insomnia or, whatever's going with that. And then there's the drop on the other side,
Mm-hmm.
right? And depending upon how easily resolved the pregnancy is, like you may even need intervention or surgery or recovery time or medications or, and like all of these things are physically really hard.
Mm-hmm.
And we're in this space where I almost said was supposed to. I don't know if it's that supposed to. I don't know that the time when you're grieving and bleeding and in pain and recovering is like the time to tell all your coworkers I was pregnant, now I'm not. That
Right.
feels like almost like more. It's too
Mm-hmm.
much to carry. Like I can't carry a reaction to this news
Yeah.
with my own reaction to this news. And so then you do end up really much being alone. On
Mm-hmm.
the other hand, one of the things I want to bring to the conversation is I was actually curious because miscarriage I'm personally familiar with, but I've also supported clients through like later pregnancy loss.
Yeah.
Um, whether that was like unexpected or that was related to chromosomal abnormalities and the choice to end before the pregnancy ended itself, or, like all different versions of later pregnancy loss. And so I was kind of curious to see, again, this is not information for people who are currently pregnant, but if you're somebody who's feeling alone, I was actually quite shocked at how high the numbers were.
Yeah.
And so, 1 in 5 known pregnancies will end before 12 weeks. Known pregnancies. The number is probably higher. This is from the Mayo Clinic. It's probably higher
Mm-hmm.
than that because some people, the pregnancy ends before they get a positive test or,
Yeah.
and then they just think it's a really painful period or something. But these two things surprised me. The March of Dimes says as many as 1 in 20 pregnancies end between 13 and 20 weeks.
Oh wow. Yeah, that's higher
I
than I
was like,
realized.
what? Now there's a range they give. That's the high end of that range. So that's like the high estimate. But even as many as that is like shocking to me. But
Yeah.
because when you get to 30 to 20 weeks, more people do know. You may even be showing.
Mm-hmm.
You may have to go through intervention to make sure that you are not at risk of like infection or retained anything. And so, it that to me was like, uh, wow, that's a lot of people. And
It's
then
a
one
lot.
in 175 births births are stillbirths, meaning
Mm-hmm.
pregnancy 20 weeks and on
Mm-hmm.
uh, of a non-living baby. And then the that which is about the same as the number of infants that pass in the first year of life, 1 in 175. And I was like, and that's coming from the CDC. So like
Oh,
that was shocking to me, to be honest with
yeah.
you. I was expecting it to be like 1 in 1,000.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so why I'm bringing that in now is because we're talking about the really private pain of like an early loss where it feels like it's so ambiguous, it's so isolated, it's so almost secretive by default. But then we have this other end of people who had a very known pregnancy, who
Yeah.
maybe even had like a baby shower, who had coworkers, who had family members excited, and then they do not have a living healthy baby at the end of it.
Yeah.
Um, which I feel like, again, there's similarities there of the birth date that was supposed to be, how old the baby would be now, the sibling relationship that didn't get to happen.
Yeah.
Um,
Seeing other kids in the world that are the age that your baby would have been. It's yeah, it's unavoidable. It's everywhere.
yeah. And for me, like my miscarriage was early, and I had a friend who had a really similar due date.
Mm.
and went on to have a healthy pregnancy and delivery. And so her child is this like marker in my mind of like the child that would have been.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's even more so when the further you get into that pregnancy, or if you even give birth, like there's this sense of like the child that would have been.
Yep. Yep.
Um, I don't know. What do you think about this phrase? There's this phrase called ghosts in the nursery. Have you come across
Mm.
this?
Mm-mm.
It's this idea of, and the ways I've heard it, it's an old timey phrase, but it's this idea of, especially like previous generations where loss was even more common,
Mm-hmm.
um, that when a baby is born, a healthy baby is born into a home, that like there could be ghosts there.
Mm-hmm.
There could be the baby that, or the pregnancy that didn't result in a healthy baby. There could be the baby that didn't live. There could be, right. And so there's this idea of like what we see on the outside is a mom and a baby smiling.
Mm-hmm.
And on the inside, she may feel this sense of like absences,
Yeah.
something not there that should be there,
Yeah. Yeah. I love,
and even
I,
possibly somebody who like who the baby who is here, in my case, like my oldest wouldn't be here.
yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I know it's such a crazy, and that's that making meaning, right? That everybody's on their own path to making their own meaning. And I say this to clients all the time too, when they're in it, that they're on the path and they're
Mm-hmm.
somewhere along their path and their journey. And they will get to an end point in terms of fertility, in terms of their family being complete. And that when you're in the path, you can only see where you're at right now, but when you
Mm-hmm.
get to a certain point, you're able to zoom out and see your entire process, see the entire meaning for yourself or not. I mean, it's not something that you have to push yourself to get there. Because I don't believe that you should have to make meaning for losing a child. You don't have to create a story that makes that make sense, because it doesn't make sense. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but for some people, like for myself, I same exact thing. I look at my youngest now, who's my rainbow baby, and she would not have been here had I had two other babies. There's just no
Mm-hmm.
way. And
Mm-hmm.
so now I'm at the point in my journey. I know we're done having kids. I know where my story ended, and I can make the meaning for myself. But it took me
Right.
a long time to get there, and it's not
Yeah.
that doesn't look the same for everybody.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's, I love that the way that you approach that is like giving so much permission for different ways of approaching it, because I feel like, we don't always know how the fertility journey ends. Sometimes
Yeah.
the last pregnancy or the last baby is the loss,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? And you just don't know that until you're way far out, and you don't know
Mm-hmm.
what you're going to make of that, and you don't know how you're going to feel of it, and it's hard because that process takes years. And when you're
Yeah.
in it, and there's a lot of why,
Yeah.
it's like you'd like to have sort of the concluding statement, whatever that is, and there's just no way to rush that at all, and there's no way to know what it's going to be. I think for me, because I so connected within the community of people struggling with infertility, that I feel
Mm-hmm.
like one of the tendencies is to be like, oh, just have another, or
Mm-hmm.
at least you can have another, or at least you have other living children, or
Mm-hmm.
this assumption that it will end with a rainbow baby, which isn't always a safe assumption. Some
Yeah.
people who are experiencing loss have had a really long road to even get that pregnancy, and there's not any sort of sense of guarantee that that's going to happen for them at all.
Yeah.
And so that ambiguous sort of, how does this end? And you
Mm-hmm.
actually don't know. You
Yeah.
really don't know how it's going to end until you get to the other side. And what we hope for everybody is that at some point you look at the totality of it and you say, like, I am at peace with where this ended for me. That's what you hope for everybody, whatever that means. But
Yeah.
like, there's certainly no guarantee of that.
No. No. It
Yeah.
is such a hard, I mean, it's just so hard. It is so, and it's, when you were talking about women who have, or families who have lost babies later term too, or even infants, that is, I can't even imagine it. Sometimes when I'm sitting with a client who has experienced something like that, I can tap
Mm-hmm.
into my own personal grief a little bit. But when I think about parents who have gone through something like that, it is unimaginable. And so yeah, it's just such a heavy thing. And if you're listening to this and you're in this right now, my heart is just so with you, because
Mm-hmm.
it's just such a heavy burden to be carrying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One of the things you said earlier that I just want to bring back into this moment is this, like, it's your process. And so here's our pop quiz. Do you remember off the top of your head the stages of grief?
Oh gosh,
Right. So
you're gonna
we've
pop quiz
got,
me. We've
I
got
know, right? I'll help you. We've got denial,
bargaining,
bargaining, anger,
anger,
depression,
depression,
right? And acceptance.
acceptance. Yeah.
So if you're not familiar, this is an old theory. Isn't it Kubler-Ross? I
Mm-hmm.
think that came up with this, that there's these stages of grief. And just to be clear, they go in any order
And you bet,
and
yeah. And you can
and you
go in
bounce
one
around
and
between
out
them.
one.
You
Yes.
can be in denial one moment, and then you can be in depression the next moment, and then you can be in bargaining, and then back to denial.
Mm-hmm.
Um, one of the things that I feel like gets a bad rap in psychology is denial.
Mm-hmm.
I'm
Mm-hmm.
personally a big fan.
Mm-hmm.
I think it has a really important place. And I wanted to say that earlier, and I think I'll say that again here, which is like when we are trying to process something that's too big,
Mm-hmm.
and it's like our computing system has become overwhelmed,
Yeah.
right? Then denial is self protective. Denial is a way to keep putting one foot in front of the other for a little while.
Mm-hmm.
And for myself personally, every time in my life I've experienced a really big shock, like a big piece of news that's kind of like earth shattering for me, I can absolutely trace that there is a time period right after receiving it where I keep acting like nothing happened.
Mm-hmm. Me too.
I just keep, okay, I'm going to go back to work now. Like, I'm going to go make some sandwiches, like,
Mm-hmm.
um, and it's comical looking back because it's like, what are you doing? But
Mm-hmm.
my like psychology was not, my psyche was like not ready yet to absorb the enormity of the shift, and it
Yeah.
needed to happen over a little bit of time instead of all in
Mm-hmm.
one moment. I couldn't just pivot that hard in one moment.
Yep.
And so it took maybe a few days or however long it took before I could begin to get out of numb and get out of stunned and get into feeling what I was feeling as a reaction to that. But what I want to say is like, that's okay.
Yes. Yeah. And
That's,
unavoidable. I mean, I really think it's unavoidable.
yeah. Yeah. I feel like, when we're talking about these huge things, like if you're and you're probably not listening to us right now if you're in denial currently, because
That's true.
you're probably avoiding conversations like this. We're probably talking to the like angry, depressed stages.
Mm-hmm.
My guess is if you're bargaining, which is I think a version of denial, it's this idea that you can kind of sort of make it better and not quite
Mm-hmm.
have to swallow it whole. And you know
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
but I wanted to say that because I think sometimes the rainbow baby is a version of bargaining,
Mm-hmm.
and for some people that can go on for quite a long time, and that's okay.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
okay that you're holding on to that. And that's how you're holding on to hope. And that's how you're holding on to functioning. And that's how you're moving through it. It's okay.
Yeah.
And also, there is a space that I see for people. I want to say this carefully. I don't want to be like fake sunshine and rainbows. No pun intended. But it's okay to hold on to that. And it's also okay if you need to let it go one day.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that there is a space where you will be okay eventually.
Yeah. Absolutely. Humans are so adaptable. That's another thing that I remind myself when I'm in any kind of grief, when I'm in any kind of hardship in my life, that we're adaptable. And
Mm-hmm.
and I do believe that if we let ourselves process, if we let ourselves go through the hard of it all, that there's no way we won't come out the other side in some way healed.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't mean that makes it okay. That doesn't mean it takes it away, but in some way, some healing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So if you're that person right now that's in the midst of this, what are some things that you would say, like speaking to that person right now, as we kind of wrap up, to say, like, here's a good idea for you. Here's my best recommendation of putting one foot in front of the other. Here's some resources, or just like, speaking to that person right now.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I wanted to say when you were talking about bargaining, because I think it's really important when there's any kind of loss, I notice that parents tend to do the bargaining of self-blame in some way of if only I had done
Mm,
this, if only I hadn't done this. And trying to take some kind of ownership in the loss. And that can create a lot of shame. It can just create a lot of internal battles that you don't I know I wasn't prepared for that piece of it, even though logically every part of my brain knew that I wasn't responsible. It's still, you still go through, did I eat the wrong thing? Did I do, and I think that's an important piece of bargaining to talk about too, of just that, that you don't have control. We don't have control in all of those things, and to label that as it's grief, it's part of grief and it's part of bargaining, and that's
Mm-hmm.
okay. And I think the
Yeah.
biggest piece of advice I have is give yourself grace no matter where you're at in the process. If you're needing to be in denial, let yourself be in denial. If you're needing to, if you need, ask for what you need, I guess, is probably the biggest thing.
Ooh, I love that.
um,
Yeah.
and
Mm-hmm.
lead with that. If you know that you have a person who's trying to offer you support, but maybe they're going to say the wrong thing, that it's okay to say to them, you don't have to have the answers, I just want you to sit with me, or can I have
Mm-hmm.
a hug?
Or
Ask for
just
what you
like,
need.
what I really need right now is just a listening ear.
Yeah, or
Or
not. What I really need right
what I
now
really
is to
now is
not talk about it.
space.
Yeah. Yeah.
What I need is space, or what I really need right now is to forget about it and have some fun for a minute,
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
any of the above. What I really need right now is a great phrase, like to look at your loving person who might be missing the mark with good intentions. Now we're making the assumption that this is a well-intentioned person,
Hmm.
right? That is a safe person and they're just like not quite reading the room very well.
Yeah.
It's okay to look at them and just like, what I really need right now is.
Hmm.
And that is you have permission indefinitely to say that to people. What I really need to your partner, what I really need right now is,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
What I
Yeah.
really need right now is. And I think that's a really great phrase because it gets out of sort of blame or finger pointing or like a back and forth conflict, which like
Hmm.
you really don't need. You just don't
No.
need it right now. Like you don't need to be in conflict with the people around you when you're grieving and your heart is heavy. It's already enough.
Hmm.
Um, so it doesn't really get into like, why would you say that? Why would you think that would help me? That's not even what I want, which is an understandable reaction to some of the things people say and do. But it skips all of that
Yeah.
and gets to the point. What I really need right now is,
Yeah. And,
yeah,
and saying that to yourself internally too, when we're talking about grief is also cyclical. Like when you're living and it's the year anniversary, or you're coming up and it would have been the due date, or any of those things, you're going to go through grief cyclically sometimes. And so giving yourself that internal, like, what do I need right now? Do I need to celebrate this anniversary? Is there something I can do that's going to honor my baby that I lost? Do I want to do that? So asking yourself that internally too. I know a lot of times my clients will, especially if people from the outside, like, let's say someone's gone through a loss, and then the question is, do you have any children? Or how many children do you have? I have so many clients who get really hung up on, I don't know
how to
how to answer
answer.
that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And just that, giving yourself permission of, I say to clients, well, why don't we come up with something to just have in your back pocket that you can
Mm-hmm.
pull out that you feel comfortable with every time that question is asked.
Mm-hmm.
And
I
sometimes
love
that
that.
is, yeah, and sometimes it's an answer that includes the baby you've lost. Sometimes it's an answer that doesn't. And that's
Yeah.
okay too. You don't have to take care of
You don't
anyone
owe
else around you.
everybody your story.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And you
I
don't
love
have to
that.
take care of them. Like, it's an uncomfortable conversation. And I think sometimes when you're the one who's experienced the loss, you're very aware of how uncomfortable the person in front of you is when you're having the conversation. But just reminding yourself, you don't have to take care of them, and you can
Mm-hmm.
you can just say out loud whatever it is that you need.
Yeah, I love that you're saying that, Megan. And I think that's such an important way of like taking care of yourself because what I see when I'm working with people who have like a raw, fresh loss um, is that they're torn in part because it feels like they're not acknowledging that baby.
Yeah.
It's not even necessarily about the other person. Sometimes it is, but it's also about like if I say no or if I don't like, is that somehow not acknowledging their presence? Not,
Yeah.
is there disloyalty in that? And I think it's so important to talk about that ahead of time and come up with a plan and to know that you really don't owe anybody your story.
Mm-hmm.
There are a lot of truths that we live that we don't go telling everybody because not everybody has the right to hear it, and that's okay.
Yeah.
One of the things to piggyback on what you're saying, I love with clients to talk about like A team, the B team, the C team. Like we have A team answers, B team answers, C team answers,
Mm-hmm.
right? There's like sometimes the answer is like nope. Sometimes these answers is like yeah, I had a loss in the end, and
Mm-hmm.
sometimes the answer is actually here's more of my story with those
Mm-hmm.
inner people, but not everybody gets that.
Yeah.
That's such a good one. I love what you said about blaming yourself. I think that's so great that you highlighted that because It is a form of bargaining. It is a very predictable part of grief. And I don't know that we talk about it enough. And I want to highlight here that I think this is where, as much as I'm happy that social media gives us the ability to connect with people who've had similar experiences, I think this can be where it can get a little bit toxic.
Yeah.
Because everybody there is in this very loud verbal process of finding blame. And it can feed that if you're not intentional about how you're approaching the information that you're consuming.
Yeah.
Right. You can get really stuck in woulda, coulda, shoulda.
Yep.
And it's not that, and it is a valuable part. And I don't want you to skip it, but I also want you to be mindful of if the people around you, metaphorically around you, are like contributing to the self-blame.
Yeah.
Does that make sense what I mean?
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
feel like there's no shortage of information online for mom guilt.
No. And we have enough of it as is without the information online.
Want to find a way you messed up? Here you go.
Here's a group for it.
Here's a group for it where we all messed up the same way and none of us have healed it. And let's just feed it in each other, right?
Yeah.
So just be mindful that every stage you're in has a purpose and it's okay to be in that group for today. But if you find that one day you go to log in and it feels like actually my day is going okay, and if I log into this group, it's not, listen to that. That's okay too.
Yeah. And, if you're going through loss too, social media is a huge trigger. It can be a huge trigger. So it's okay to delete social media while you're in it. We don't need to be seeing every pregnancy announcement or every baby announcement or any of those things. It can just flood, especially if you are in a pregnancy, then the algorithm knows. And so you're fed all that information. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. The algorithm knows before your family does. The algorithm's like, oh, you're 6 weeks pregnant. Here you go. Like, dang it.
Yeah.
Damn algorithm. Yeah, it knows. Totally. Yeah. And so it's feeding you stuff. And, grief is similar to trauma in that it's like a prioritization in human experience. It can really hijack whatever you were going to go do. Grief could just kind of hijack it. And so because of that, it will get your attention. And because it will get your attention, it is something that that any sort of algorithmic feed that's trying to keep you engaged will feed you because it will keep you engaged the same way that trauma content will keep you engaged.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so again, back to being mindful of use it when it helps you get out of isolation, use it when it helps provide comfort and you feel less alone. Be very aware when you were like doing okay before you opened it and now you're not. Be really, really mindful of that and protect yourself.
Yeah.
That's such good advice.
Yeah. Becca from Dancy Perinatal said in a training to us once, and I will never forget it, that when you're going to Google, ask yourself, am I information seeking or am I support seeking? Because Google's great for information. Sometimes it's any information you want.
Good or bad information. It's all kinds of information. Yep.
Yeah. But a lot of times when you're going through something like that, when you're going to Google trying to find answers, you're support seeking. And just notice that internally, because Google's not going to give you the support. And then it's, where is my support? Where do I find support? Who are my people?
Such good advice. Thank you for reminding us of that. That is great. Am I looking for support right now or am I looking for information? If it's information, proceed. If it's support, probably not here.
Yeah.
Probably not going to get it here. Oh, that's brilliant. So final thoughts, if you're in the depths of this right now, and you're just feeling like, one of the things I love that you said about grief being in the body, I will add to that. What I often say with clients is like, grief is like ocean waves. Like no matter how big that wave looks and no matter how much it threatens to drown you, the wave does pass. It peaks and it valleys. It will not be constant because it can feel like I'm gonna be in this forever.
Yeah.
Even when you're in grief, the waves of pain with it are waves, right? Where you might have a moment and you might have a hard, painful moment that lasts a little while, but then it passes for that moment and it will come again. But for that moment, it's passed. And so the waves are okay. It's okay to laugh. It's okay to cry. It's okay to be highs and lows. Grief is a very normal process in your body. And if you just allow it without judgment, it's going to go a lot smoother. It's going to pass a lot easier. Just allow it. And I guess to that person that's listening to us, it's important, I guess, to say, it can feel like drowning.
Yeah.
And keep going.
Yeah.
Ask for what you need.
Ask for what you need. find your people, ask for what you need, share when you want to share, take space when
Mhm.
you want to take space. I tell clients too, if you have those moments of the wave passing and it's really heavy, to try to lean into that when it's coming, if
Mhm.
you're in a safe enough space to do it. Let yourself really cry. Let the energy just kind of go through your body.
Mhm.
It's heavy, it's hard, but then the wave passes, and you
Mhm.
do catch your breath again.
You do. I love that. Thank you so much, Megan. I really
Yeah.
appreciate you sharing your personal story and opening up and just giving people like perspective, from the inside, not just like academically or as an expert in it, which you are, but you're talking about it from like the inside of it in a really tender-hearted way that I feel like is just so good. And I put myself back in the shoes of like all those years ago, like what a beautiful healing thing it would be to receive that. So thank you for being that for us and for your clients. And I'm super appreciative you're here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.